I'm thrilled to invite Professor Maria Guajardo and Mr. David Adams, who are esteemed individuals that will grace our stage with their inspiring presence. Professor Maria is a distinguished professor of leadership studies at Soka University in Japan and has broken barriers as the first female and non-Japanese dean and vice president at the university. Her research focuses on leadership, global citizenship, DEIB, which is diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, women, and critical pedagogy. David Adams is the CEO of the Urban Assembly in USA and a board member of Castle. He's a leader in social emotional learning and educational equity. He created the Resilient Scholars Program, which is a groundbreaking approach to integrating SEL into the curriculum. Join us in warmly welcoming Professor Maria Guajardo and David Adams as we celebrate their accomplishments and embrace the wisdom for a memorable learning experience. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Rahab, and I want to say good morning to everybody here on the call. I'm calling in from United States on the East Coast, so it's about 6 o'clock in the morning. I know Professor Guajardo and I are really excited to talk about the global state of education. What's going to happen is I'm going to give a short presentation, and Professor Guajardo is also going to give a short presentation. And then we're going to have an opportunity to talk back to the audience using the question and answer feature. So we're really excited to start off and have this conversation. And to do that, I'm going to share my screen and talk a little bit about what education is looking like in 2023. So first, on behalf of the Urban Assembly, we're very excited to be here. I'm very excited to have an opportunity to speak to our audience today across the world on the global state of education. In order to do this, we're going to ground ourselves in the Global Sustainable Development Goals. We know there are 17 goals for the people, for the planet, and these goals were adopted by member states in 2015 and cover everything from education to the climate to poverty across the world. As you recall, by 2030, our global community made a commitment to achieve these goals across the world. There are 17 Sustainable Development Goals, everything from peace and justice to life on land. But today, we're going to really focus on SDG 4, which is focusing on quality education. So let's take a look at what are the subdivisions of the quality education goal. We have quality primary and secondary education for all, early childhood and pre-primary education, equal access to higher education, skills for decent work. We have gender equality and equal access for all, youth and adult literacy, sustainable development and global citizenship, safe and inclusive learning environments, scholarships for higher education, and last, of course not least, professional development for teachers. So how are we doing around these sustainable development goals, specifically on this idea of quality education for all? Well, the first thing we want to talk about is that we cannot underestimate the impact the pandemic has had on learning loss across the world. Here you see a statistic that says that the pandemic caused learning losses in 4 out of 5 of the 104 countries studied. And here in the United States, we saw learning loss from everything from math to literacy across populations and across the time of the pandemic. Now let's get into some of the specifics with regards to one of the subdivisions of the SDGs for quality education, primary and secondary school. We know that the pace of primary and secondary school completion is rising, but as you can see, it's still too slow and too uneven with regards to how many folks are doing it. On the left-hand side, you see here that we still are lagging in sub-Saharan Africa with regards to enrollment and graduation in primary and secondary school. And you can see where the world is on this last bullet point over here with regards to what we were doing in 2015 to what we are doing in 2021, the last time this indicator was measured. We're making progress, but the pace is too slow and uneven. Let's talk about access to early childhood. Again, the moral of this story is that there has been expansion, but progress has slowed since 2015. So you can see here that we're seeing increases in the participation rate in organized learning. And this is key because this is before the first year of primary school. And we know that this kind of learning lays the foundation for high quality primary development in terms of the first year of schooling. Now let's take a moment to move from the world to the United States. As I said before, we can't underestimate the impact of the pandemic on learning loss across the world. Here in the United States, we have the National Assessment of Educational Progress, otherwise known as the NAEP. And as you see here from this graph, the largest decrease since 1990 has accrued between 2020 and 2022, which are the years of the pandemic. So as you can see on the NAEP, the United States has been making steady progress since 1971 when the assessment was first measured, and the first dip really came from 2000 to 2022 since 1990. And unfortunately, the impact in math is even worse. You can see about 7 points decrease for math from 20 to 22, and this is solely associated with the pandemic. It's the first decrease ever in the United States measurement of mathematical performance. While we're looking at average numbers here, I can tell you that the impact for boys in particular and boys of color in particular has been even greater than that 7-point average decrease across populations. Let's take one moment to think about the state of the American student, and we're going to use this. We're going to do this using the CRP, the Center for Reinventing Public Education, the latest report, the state of the American student. And the tagline is not strong. We are failing our students of the pandemic age. As I said before, is about 7 months behind our population is in reading. About 7.4 months it will take of additional instruction to ensure that students in the 8th grade can catch up to pre-pandemic levels in reading. And math is even worse, about 9 months before. It will take about 9 additional months of education and learning to ensure that our 8th graders can catch up to pre-pandemic levels. Even more devastating on learning loss has been absenteeism and enrollment. Let's take a second to look at the numbers in the United States of students who are more absentee than they used to be. About 16 million students are estimated as chronically absent, which is missing more than 10% of schools during 21-22. About 72% of public schools across the United States have reported an increase in chronic absenteeism, including here at the Urban Assembly. About 10% of students reported missing in 5 or more days, and 27% of students, talking about enrollment now, reported recent enrollment declines of 5% or more. And that's also seen in higher education. So we are seeing an engagement with school challenge. Everything from absenteeism has increased to enrollment altogether has increased since the pandemic has ended. Now, that wasn't challenging enough. We are entering a new generation of education, where ChatGPT and the generative power of education and AI are really calling into question, what does it mean to be educated in 2023? What are the kinds of skills that'll be relevant in 2030, 2040, and beyond? And how are education systems aligning to this new disruptive technology with regards to the educational process? So again, we're going to double down on this notion of the skills for the future, things like critical thinking, communication, citizenship, creativity, growth mindset, and collaboration. These are skills that will be future-proof, even in the age of ChatGPT. So in summary, the state of education in 2023 is still recovering from the effects of COVID-19. The progress towards SDG goals is uneven across the world, and the role of generative AI is calling into question the kind of education needed for global flourishing in the next 10 to 20 years. That completes my overview of the global state of education. Professor Guajardo, I want to turn it over to you so that we can have your space of the state of education. And then I think we're going to open it up to our folks in the audience to have a conversation. Is that right? All right, Professor Guajardo, over to you.
All right, David, thank you so much. Well, what you laid a wonderful foundation, and what I would like to do is really challenge us to consider what will we do moving forward. So as you laid out, David, the current post-pandemic educational challenges, they necessitate a redesign of education that will break away from the strategy of making just minor piecemeal adjustments to the education enterprise. This redefinition, this redesign by definition will disrupt and unsettle the power brokers that have had a hold on the present state of education to get to the statistics that you just shared with us. So if we are serious about transforming education, then let us courageously engage to unlearn, relearn, and learn anew. So what do I mean by this? To unlearn. The safe and familiar approaches to education have been stripped to their core by COVID-19, as we saw in your slides. Human flourishing will require a letting go of what no longer works, or to be honest, that never worked except for the few. We must be willing to unlearn what does not serve us any longer. And then move on to relearning. Let's break open new possibilities. As the educator Parker Palmer suggests, let's break open, not break apart. Let us infuse hope and joy into our learning spaces. I often say to my students, suffering is optional. So let's learn how to relearn the hope and joy in education. And finally, to learn anew. What will it take to move from the current state of education, full of limitations, to a state of learning that is created by design and not by default? It takes the commitment of all of us present today, a commitment of possibility, a commitment to a vision that we can and we must do better. So let's ask the question, what action is needed? First, the purpose of education and the pipeline of leaders must be revisited. It must be dismantled and newly created to encompass a vision of possibilities. We must prioritize learners both locally and globally. I want to use the metaphor of a trap door, a door that leads to another hidden room. This metaphor of a trap door reflects the current stoppage in innovation in education. It's a trap door that is locked, and yet the future lies behind that door. Today, we are being asked to prepare for a future we cannot see. Change is happening at lightning speed, and the old models of education are not enough. So, staying with the metaphor, to get through this trap door, we need gatekeepers to open the door. The next generation of education needs to be transformed with the unknown. So, innovation and flexibility will be critical. I call on all of you to be those gatekeepers, to open the gates of equity, quality, and relevance in education so that we can, in fact, prepare our children and young adults for the future we cannot see. Let us use this gathering today and over the next couple of days. Yes, let's use this gathering of change agents, and that means you. You are the change agent we have been waiting for. Change agents come from all countries, they are all ages, and they have diverse global views. Be that change agent that will boldly open the gate and step in. One of my favorite definitions of leadership comes from Peter Senge, and he says, the capacity of a human community to shape the future. That is what leadership is. So, as educational change agents, and that includes me and everyone here, we are shaping the future through the pathway of education, an enterprise that shapes both the planet and its people. And this work, seriously, this work will require a community. As a professor in leadership studies, my job is to raise the next generation of global leaders. Engaging in multi-year experiences with my students, they have exposed the paradox in this educational enterprise. While they benefit from this learning environment, certainly, now active learning, social emotional learning, what they have discovered, though, is that there remains a disconnect between theory and practice. So piecemeal approaches to transformative education represent the tip of an iceberg. The iceberg, as we know, it's exposed, 10% is exposed, but it's hiding all the possibilities that are deep within. So over the course of the next 3 days, let's unite and explore. Let's open that trapdoor and come together to unlearn, relearn, and learn anew. Students want to be engaged learners, and yet they are being held hostage by leadership, approaches in education, teaching practices, As Aryan shared in his opening words, those practices are often discouraging, disregarding, and diminishing. Too often, students feel pressured into roles as passive learners, and they're discouraged from critical thinking and inquiry. In raising the next generation of leaders, the purpose of education must be redefined, and a pipeline of emerging leaders must be intentionally fostered. UNESCO published a futures report 2 years ago. In it, they present the case for a new social contract for education, a future radically disrupted by a pandemic. This report is promising as it describes the shift in focus from various levels of the educational enterprise, assuring us the right to education and designing education as a collaborative endeavor for all. I would suggest that this futures report is itself a North Star. Its current and future educational change agents must participate. We must participate in this new social contract. The Brazilian educator Paulo Freire suggested that critical pedagogy, which is an approach to learning to question, probe, and reflect, is needed. And I agree. If we're going to transform education, our learning spaces will need to unlearn, relearn, and co-create. And so we are making room as education change agents to embody this shifting of a new way of being and leading. And I would suggest we're on the cusp of a renaissance or transformation that needs three foundational pillars. What are those? First, education must be relevant. It must be inclusive of one's narrative. Students and teachers are shaped and influenced by their past and their present. And this includes many, many cultural worldviews. This complexity must be embraced, not feared or discouraged. Our job isn't to make the learning space simple or generic. Our job is to heighten our level of comfort with the complexity that we all bring. Second, transformative approaches in education need to bring justice, equity, dignity, and belonging. As our students, our emerging leaders redefine the purpose of leadership, power, and education, they must work to uncover their voices and not be silenced. So, this work will require deep listening and authentic dialogue. Validation of this new perspective where we are aligning both theory and action. So, to recap, we need relevance, we need justice and equity, and third, we need something new. We need innovation and incubation. We need to be able to acknowledge that change will create conflict and tension, but let's move through this together and emerge on the other side. Now, let's be honest. These innovative approaches, they're going to be messy, challenging, and questioning of the status quo. But this is the work that will set the stage for a new beginning, supporting you and me as the change agents to step into the unknown and begin incubating new approaches. I believe that our role is to reimagine the role of education for social transformation, and it will require that the current process, which confines our young people, our students, that we be able to course correct, that we open that trap door. Transformative education will require relevance, justice and equity, and innovative approaches. It will require gatekeepers like you and me. In order for human flourishing to occur, which is our destination, jump in with me, engage, meet someone new at this conference, and be open to new ways of doing our work. Be bold. We are at the crossroads of education. So together, let's advance. I am convinced that we can do better. I am convinced that the next 3 days hold promise and practice of what is needed today in education. So be my partner, and together, let's unlearn, relearn, and learn anew. Our future depends on it. Thank you.
Well, Professor Guajardo, that was an amazing opening. I heard you talk about things like reimagining education. I heard you invite us all into a space where transformative education and the social contract is rethought through. And I was hoping we can start to have a little bit of conversation as folks start to ask some questions in the chat. But the first thing I think that was really resonant with me is we talked about this notion of a new purpose of education. And during my section, we talked a little bit about ChatGPT and the role ChatGPT may play in really forcing us to do all the innovative things, to open up the gates, to really push ourselves to think about what is the purpose of education and how does it fulfill part of the social contract. So I want to throw this back over to you and thinking through the role of AI and really forcing us as a community and global community to reimagine what it means to be educated in 2030 and beyond.
David, I believe that AI does provide an opportunity. However, what we need in education is to humanize this learning experience, not dehumanize. And so we are going to have to be smarter than the technology that is emerging, because tools aren't what create learning experiences in and of themselves. No one has ever said to me, "Oh, you know what, Maria? My third grade curriculum textbook was what changed my life." No, they don't say that. They don't say, "Oh, that new program on the website of A, B, or C, that was just No, 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 no. Maybe it made your life efficient. Maybe it made it more comprehensive, but we cannot lose the human connection. We saw this during COVID-19,
Sure did.
that social distancing was really physical distancing, and our students suffered because of it, despite our best efforts. So, my caution is, and my challenge to all of us is, let's humanize education with the new tools, not dehumanize it.
Well, let me walk this back because I think you said something very important. And one of the key lessons that we did learn during the pandemic was that learning is a relational process. It happens in relationship with material, in relationship with others, and information delivery was insufficient to motivate students to deeply embed knowledge. And we're seeing that in a very kind of discrete learning loss statistics that I presented. But even more importantly, we were seeing it in the mental health crisis, the crisis of belonging, and the crisis of connection, the crisis that young people are still struggling to respond to. So I want to really take a moment to talk about this notion of how learning happens. What does it mean to be in a transformative education context, and the role of relationships in driving learning, no matter what the age that we're learning for.
I believe that learning is personal, learning is relational, and learning happens in community.
Mhm.
That is where I start. When I walk into a classroom of strangers, because that's what happens at the beginning of every academic semester, right? You walk into a classroom of strangers. I walk in with this intention of, how do we create community? Because I don't want to foster competition amongst my students. I want all of us to be able to recognize that we move forward. And while some of us have superpowers that allow us to jump ahead, we all have superpowers. And as an educator, my role is to be able to create a learning space that allows this engagement, sustained engagement, to occur.
Mhm.
Setting a preschooler in front of an iPad, while it may pacify the child, the toddler, it lacks that sense of relationship, David, that you were describing, that is so needed.
Mhm.
I would suggest to you that that missing element happens not only with toddlers with a tablet, but it happens with university students in front of a PowerPoint slide deck of 50 slides, right? We have to find an approach where, and we need to follow students. Let me just say that, David, I think we have to be, yeah, the comfort of our old ways. My generation, we have to learn from the young people. Oh my goodness, I can't even imagine how their brain is wired some days. That's what I am looking forward to. I
Well,
want to learn from them.
I want to elevate this notion of learning in community. We know this is the International Conference on Transformative Education. We know we have SDGs that are focused on this notion of global citizenship. Um, And yet, sometimes schools have struggled with their role of building community. We have schools sometimes that may not quite understand the role the education system plays in creating cohesion in society. And so I want to take some time here to think about what it means to be in community and the role the education system plays in creating community. And I want to reemphasize this because forging community and the word forge, right, it creates this notion of different metals that are being melted into one and then recast. And so let me turn this back over to you, Professor Guajardo, and I want to talk about the role of education in forging community, the education system across the world.
Okay, David. So first of all, I just have to ask you to call me Maria,
Oh,
please. Okay, so we'll start there. You know, David, I think that if we want to create community for students, our teachers need to feel that they are in community.
mhm,
Our teachers are battling lack of resources, lack of time, a request to do everything for everyone at every moment.
yeah.
And you cannot give if you yourself are running on fumes, if you are empty. So, community is absolutely central, but it begins with us, the educators. It begins with us being able to compassionately be able to recognize each other's humanity and uphold our own sense of dignity with one another. So, how we begin to do this work, it begins with each of us connecting to one another. And I'm not just being Pollyannish or overly optimistic about this. This is the real work. This is where we begin to fill our own batteries, if you will, in order to be able to then step into creating community with our students. We can't tell them to do it if we ourselves are not doing it. I
Well,
mean,
we're
what do you think of this one, David?
I think it's complicated. We're in a really specific political space right now in the United States, where folks are continually questioning the role of the education system itself and the responsibility of the education system itself to create a cohesive sense of identity across our country. There are parents who say teaching social and emotional skills, teaching the values of community, are not the role of the education system, but are the role of parents and/or the private sector. And so I'm struggling, Maria. I'm struggling to ensure that at one hand, schools can't do everything, right? And I feel like the education system tends to be the last stop shop for all of societal challenges, right? We will solve it in schools, but we can do something. And I do believe in the vision that you put forth, right, which is that schools could and should be the foundation to community and a common sense of identity across countries. And we do that by listening. We do that by building common narratives. And we do it by building the kind of identities and stories that multiple people can see themselves in.
I think it comes back to that sense of relevance, that is one of the pillars of this conference, right?
Mm,
Our work has to be relevant. Children, students have to come into a learning space that feels relevant to them. I also believe that in this learning space, for the moment and the time that I have with young learners, my job is to also bear witness to their life. They are not numbers, they are comprehensive, intact human beings. And while they may challenge and face their own challenges, Elie Wiesel, the Nobel Peace Laureate, said, you know, our job is to bear witness to how we are living and experiencing life. So I understand that part of the argument is that we can't be everything for everyone. And yet at the same time, I think we're missing the bigger picture here. If we are going to transform education, and I love that Georgina said, you know what? Why doesn't the community power this? Why can't it come from within? I would agree with you, Georgina. And I'd say, you know what? Let's have the teacher community. Let's have the learning space community be a community that isn't polarizing, but in fact co creating. You are not my enemy. But if I come in with that defensive stance, I am limiting myself to the possibility of what can happen in school.
Mhm. I'm so moved by this notion of co-creation, and I want to name what you mentioned with Georgina. She says, "Can we flip the narrative instead of the system influencing and creating the community? Can the community be one that drives the change to influence the system?" And in the United States, we have a history and a tradition of intensely local versions of education. We have local school boards that really drive curriculum decisions. We have states that are really accountable for education. I was just in one of our schools in Manhattan yesterday, and we had an international panel from across the world, from Brazil, from Indonesia, folks from, let's see, from Ukraine. And one of the things that was always surprising to them was the amount of independence that American schools have and American school boards have to drive curricula. And so I'm thinking about Georgina's question here. And really, ideally, we are participating in the system by electing school boards, by participating in our students' education. But ultimately, at the end of the day, Maria, um, schools are political places. The civil rights movement targeted schools as a notion of who we are as Americans. Our current conversation about schools are really focused on the narratives that we tell ourselves. And so I respect this notion of not being enemies, but we do have different sometimes visions for the role of schools and the values of schools in our space and in our politics.
Well, David, let's make no mistake. As Paulo Freire shared time after time, education is political.
That's right. That's right.
Education is political. And as you're suggesting, not only in terms of policy and governments, but what I choose to teach and
That's right.
how I choose to teach it is political. And so I am not, and I don't want to suggest this naivete that I'm naive about this sense of power differentiation, right?
Hmm.
If it's political, that means it's about power. Who has it? Who doesn't have it? How is it distributed? And it comes back to leadership, David. It
Hmm.
comes back to leadership. And so I don't speak lightly when I say you, I, and everyone attending this conference, we are in the position to be change agents.
Hmm.
As I looked at who was speaking and as I looked at the topics, voices that are young, voices that are more mature, let's say, not old, mature. But as I looked at the diversity, I was just breathless
Hmm.
because I thought I want to go to every single session.
Hmm.
This is where the Renaissance begins. So is education political? Absolutely. But political isn't a bad thing, David. And I think this is where we have to unlearn, right? Society in certain countries and in certain places is asking us to believe that. And I don't agree. I think politics and power can be relearned
Hmm.
and refashioned into something that benefits for the greater good, not a small majority or minority. So,
That's something I'm really resonant with, and we have some questions here in the chat. But Marie, before we get there, I just want to rename and restate what you said. That education is political because education is power, and political and politics is how we navigate power in society, right? And what I heard you say was that it can be channeled towards the common good. That if we use effective governance structures, if we are able to bring up the voices of multiple stakeholders, we can find some sort of common good to benefit the most of the folks in the society space. And so we have a question here from Oyi Goga, and he's saying that corruption in education in many African countries is a great challenge. And rather than abating, it seems to be a socially embedded trait. He says that this is something I believe is a big barrier to achieving SDG 4, inclusive and equitable education. How do we get out of this? And before I turn it over to you, Maria, I just want to note that you talked about leadership. You talked about the notion of the common good. You talked about individual versus collective in terms of outcomes. And I'm sure some of those key pieces can inspire some of your responses to Oyegoga as he thinks about the role of corruption in the education space in many African countries.
David, you're giving me all the hard questions here, and I appreciate you greatly. However, all right, I love this perspective. Do we take it, if I take it as this as presented, that corruption in education is occurring and is a challenge?
Mhm.
I would just like to say that it's not just in African countries, right? I'm based in Tokyo, Japan. And while it may show up differently, it's present. So this power differential is always present. And it is a barrier. It is a barrier to this vision, this collective vision of wanting to transform education. But I am not without hope here. I Because honestly, it has to start with me. I have to know what my values, my non-negotiables. I have to be able to pull on the wisdom of the collective and my own individual growth and understanding of the world. I have to be very clear as to what my purpose is. It's not to suggest that those challenges aren't diminishing and overwhelming at times. But I believe that the light is coming in through the cracks, and we have to be at the ready to recognize that, to be able to celebrate those videos that we saw at the beginning of our conference today. I mean, I was moved. I was moved to say, there's possibility. I see hope. So is corruption here? It has always been here. Is it getting worse? Some days it is. But it just reaffirms for me that I have to know who I am, what I stand for, and my belief in education.
And Maria, if I can follow up on that passionate idea, I always believe that education is society's greatest investment in itself. It's almost as if because we have a sense that society is built not in the individuals that are here now, but in the individuals that are to come, right? The institutions that we have in our nations, in our countries, our communities, will not outlast us unless somebody comes behind us with the same beliefs, with the same aspirations. And so when I think about this notion of the role of education, and what's stopping us from getting there. I'm similarly inspired to this idea that as we as a society has matured, if you think about the role of education, let's say 100, 200 years ago, it was understood that children were essentially little adults, and that their most effective function was to go straight to work, and to produce for society at 9 and 10 year olds what an 18, 19, or 20 would. And as we matured as a society and we believed and we recognized the power of education to transform human flourishing, to transform human potential, we reinvested with great expense back into our society by investing into our children. So I share your optimism here, Oyegaga. We, Professor or Maria and I, recognize some of the challenges. I do want to note that some of the biggest challenges right now facing global education are things like fees, things like book fees, uniform fees, lack of state investment in the public education space. And I know that as we continue to think about how that investment works, we'll see more and more investment and outcomes in our young people. All right, so we have a couple more questions, Maria, for us to get at here. We have Kavita, and she said that she appreciates your focus on how adults show up for themselves and others. She says that's key. The work begins with each individual. She wants to know how each of us reflect on our own practices, and are we responsible? Are we being responsible with our truth, our freedom, and our integrity? So I'll turn that over to you, Maria, and then maybe I'll speak a little bit from my perspective here in New York City.
At my university, Soka University here in Japan, the founder of our university left us a motto, or left us a saying to consider. And the saying said, "For what purpose do you cultivate wisdom? For what purpose?" And I want to connect that to our conversation right now. When Daisaku Ikeda shared that with us, it was with the intention of asking us to reflect on our purpose, our intention. Why do we do what we do? And when we can connect with our why, with our purpose, I think we begin to shed light on possibility. So how could we make it possible to reflect on our practice? I think we have to be able to connect with our truth, to connect with our North Star. In the absence of that, we will be bending to every wind that comes from the left and the right.
I'm so resonant with that, Maria. I think about our purpose in the urban assembly is to know ourselves and to know the world, right? To be able to pursue truths about ourselves and the world. Um, and the cultivation of wisdom, the cultivation of reasoning, is in order to pursue these truths. And I'd like to believe, and maybe we disagree on this, but I'd like to believe that there are some capital T truths that we can pursue with an approach to education, an approach to reasoning, and an approach to connection. Um, and so, if I may be so bold as to think about why at the Urban Assembly we cultivate wisdom, it's so that we know ourselves and that we know the world. And I hope that that can help keep us grounded as the political winds move back and forth. And hopefully, our audience feels that same sense of grounding as folks use education to do things that are not associated with truth, to stay grounded and why we cultivate a sense of wisdom.
I would say to you, David, that one of my truths is my belief in the potential of every human being that is in front of me. Those could be my students, those could be strangers, those could be a group that I'm connecting to for an afternoon. But that, if I hold that belief, and if I honor the dignity of each individual human being, if my presence is with that intention, I believe that the work that I do will, in fact, create value, right? So, yes, I agree with you, David. There are certain truths, there are certain non negotiables, there are certain values with which we approach education. And I think that need for reflection is central to being able to look forward, but also look back and then continue to take steps ahead. And I continue to be optimistic.
Well, Maria, I got to say, there's nothing more inspiring than waking up at 5 o'clock and being in the presence of someone like you, who really uplifts our spirit, calls us to action around transformative education. You talked about things like the social contract and the capacity of folks to shape the future. You talked about things like the purpose of education and the need to give gatekeepers the opportunity to remove their hands so young people can flourish. You talked about the difference between theory and practice and how you're driving a practice based approach. And you talked about a community of humanity and to what purpose do we cultivate wisdom. So, on behalf of the Urban Assembly, it's been a pleasure to be in community and relationship with you today. And I'll give you the final word to our audience here today as we welcome them to the International Conference on Transformative Education.
David, I want to thank you. And I just want to challenge us all for the next 3 days. Let's be bold. Let's be that disruptor today. This is a safe place to do it. Let's step in and encourage. This is our community of transformation for the next few days. Meet someone new, extend yourself. I believe that if we are willing to do that, education is in good hands.
Well, thank you so much, Maria. And I believe we have Dr. Pandey up next, who is going to have a welcome note off after this. So, on behalf of the Urban Assembly, on behalf of all the folks here who are inspired and dedicated to a new version of a new vision of education. That concludes our State of Education address on behalf of both Maria and myself. Thank you very much.
Thank you.